Hey there, and welcome to a story that unfolds under the shadowy skies of wartime Europe. A tale where the world's fate teeters on the actions of a single man. Tonight, we're revisiting the night when Rudolf Hess, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, vanished into darkness on a solo flight towards Scotland, only to spark one of the greatest mysteries of World War II. Trust me, you want to stay until the end, because what happens after his crash landing is as bizarre as it is heartbreaking, and you might be surprised by who really knew what and when. If you enjoy untangling the unsolved mysteries of World War II as much as I do, please feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely into this kind of deep dive. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let's turn this into a global bedtime gathering of curious minds. So go ahead, dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to 1941, where the line between calculated risk and outright madness begins to blur. Let's set the scene. May 1941. The war in Europe is raging with an intensity that's almost hard to imagine from our vantage point today. At this point, Rudolf Hess holds the number 2 spot in Hitler's inner circle, a figure trusted, or at least tolerated, with enormous power. And yet, on the night of May 10th, 1941, he makes a decision that not even his closest confidants saw coming. In absolute secrecy, Hess boards a military plane and sets out for Britain alone, with no official orders and no witnesses. It's the kind of move that sounds like the setup for a spy thriller, or maybe even an elaborate prank. But this was all too real. Just picture it. The Scottish farmer, going about his nightly routine on an ordinary spring evening, suddenly sees flames tearing through the darkness. Moments later, he finds the wreckage of a German Messerschmitt scattered across his field, the engine still ticking as it cools. Stumbling out of the debris is a dazed pilot who introduces himself as Captain Alfred Horn. This quiet rural landscape has just become the backdrop for an international incident. Of course, the mystery deepens. It doesn't take long for the British authorities to realize that their unexpected visitor isn't just any German airman. The man who parachuted out of that Messerschmitt is none other than Rudolf Hess, Hitler's own deputy. And no one, not in London, not in Berlin, not even in Hess's own household, seems to know why he's here. Now, let's walk through exactly how this happened. Earlier that evening, Hess slipped away from an airfield near Munich and climbed into a twin-engine Messerschmitt. His plan was as daring as it was reckless: fly more than 1,000 miles alone over enemy territory and land in Britain, a country at war with his own. He took off around 6 in the evening, following the Rhine northwest, then swinging out over the North Sea, hugging the darkness to avoid British radar. For hours he flew on, guided by little more than charts, maps, and a desperate sense of purpose. By 10:03 p.m., he was over southern Scotland, the coastline just a faint line in the gloom beneath him. But his luck was running out, running low on fuel and battered by cold winds. Hess had no choice but to bail out, parachuting into a field near the tiny village of Eaglesham. He hit the ground hard, spraining his ankle but surviving the jump, a small miracle given the circumstances. The farmer who discovered him wasted no time. He called in the local home guard, who arrived quickly, rifles at the ready. They found Hess limping and shaken, but surprisingly composed. And then, as if things weren't strange enough, Hess made a request that would baffle everyone involved for decades to come. He insisted, calmly and repeatedly, that he needed to speak with the Duke of Hamilton. This wasn't just a random name. Hess claimed to know the Duke personally, and he was adamant that he had an urgent message to deliver. His intended destination, he said, was Dungavel House, the Duke's estate. The Duke of Hamilton, at that time, was a respected Scottish aristocrat and a distinguished officer in the Royal Air Force. But here's where it gets even stranger. The Duke himself denied ever having met Hess. No secret correspondence, no clandestine meetings. At least, not according to the official record. So why did Hess believe that this British nobleman was the key to ending the war? According to Hess, he'd been tipped off by a friend that the Duke was part of an underground group in Britain, a faction supposedly open to negotiating peace with Germany. Hess was convinced that if he could just get an audience with the Duke, he could broker an end to the fighting, at least on Germany's terms. But this was a spectacular miscalculation. The Duke of Hamilton was not a member of any pro-German party. He was loyal to Britain and a personal friend of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The British authorities, naturally, were completely stunned. The next day, May 11th, they allowed Hess to meet with the Duke, more out of curiosity than anything else. The conversation was polite but fruitless. The Duke listened, but Churchill's government had zero interest in any kind of deal with Hitler's deputy. As for Hess, he insisted that he'd come entirely on his own, with no orders from the German leadership. He made it clear that this was a solo mission, a one-man gamble for peace. By denying any official backing, Hess unwittingly destroyed any hope he had of being treated as a diplomat. Instead of a peace envoy, he became a high-profile prisoner of war. Churchill himself was deeply suspicious of Hess's mental state. Was he an agent sent on a secret mission, or just a rogue fanatic acting on his own twisted logic? Either way, Churchill ordered that Hess be treated not as a negotiator, but as a captive. Hess was swiftly moved from one secure location to another, always under heavy guard. For a time, he was even locked away in the Tower of London, a surreal twist for a man who, just days earlier, had stood at Hitler's side. British intelligence interrogated him relentlessly, searching for any clue that might reveal a larger plot. But Hess remained steadfast. This was his idea, and his alone. As the days turned into weeks, Hess's situation grew increasingly bleak. He realized that his so-called peace mission had failed in spectacular fashion. By the middle of June, barely 5 weeks after his arrival in Britain, Hess attempted to take his own life by throwing himself down a staircase. He survived, but with serious injuries, a dramatic sign of just how desperate and unstable he'd become. Medical and psychiatric evaluations followed. The once powerful deputy of the Third Reich now appeared broken, his mind spiraling into paranoia and depression. He became withdrawn, plagued by delusions and a sense of utter defeat. Even Churchill, reflecting on the incident after the war, described Hess's flight as a deed of lunatic benevolence. In Churchill's view, Hess's act, however foolish or misguided, was motivated by a genuine, if utterly irrational, desire to do good. The British authorities concluded that Hess was a lone wolf, driven by motives no one else could quite fathom, and they treated him accordingly. Back in Germany, news of Hess's strange defection hit the Nazi leadership like a bombshell. Hitler was blindsided by the revelation that his trusted deputy had flown to enemy territory and been captured. The reaction in Berlin was panic mixed with outrage. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's propaganda chief, wrote in his diary about the shock waves that rattled both the Nazi hierarchy and the German public. Suddenly, people were openly questioning how someone so high up could have gone completely off the rails. To get ahead of the rumors and keep morale from crumbling, the Nazi regime quickly spun an official story. According to Berlin, Hess had suffered a sudden mental breakdown on the very day of his flight. The message to the German people was clear. Hess had been perfectly sane until that moment, and his flight was the result of an abrupt, isolated episode of insanity. It was an attempt to reassure the public that the regime itself was stable and that Hess's madness had come out of nowhere. Hitler wasted no time in distancing himself. Publicly, he claimed that Hess's mission was entirely unauthorized, that he'd had no knowledge of it, and certainly hadn't approved it. But, behind closed doors, Hitler was absolutely livid. Eyewitnesses later described his reaction as almost animalistic, a guttural outburst of rage and betrayal. What worried Hitler most was the fear that Churchill would use Hess's defection to cast doubt on Germany's intentions, that it might look like the Nazis were secretly begging for peace, or worse, preparing to betray their allies. Hess was stripped of all his titles and posts. His name was erased from official communications, and his responsibilities handed over to others. Inside Germany, it was as if he'd never existed. Goebbels and other leaders, still reeling from the shock, tried to comfort themselves by downplaying Hess's importance. By 1941, they insisted, Hess was already on the sidelines, an eccentric, no longer involved in serious strategy. Some even speculated that Hess's flight was a last-ditch effort to secure his legacy, to ensure that history would remember him as the Reich's eternal number 2. So, what really drove Rudolf Hess to risk everything on a solo flight into enemy territory? Was he just delusional, or was there more to the story than meets the eye? As we move into the next chapter, we'll dig deeper into the theories, the aftermath, and the enduring mysteries of Hess's incredible mission. Modern historians tend to view Hess's peace mission as a product of desperation and a warped mindset. But as always, the truth might be stranger and more elusive than anyone imagined. Don't go anywhere. The investigation is just getting started. Picture yourself in early 1941, deep inside the labyrinth of Nazi power. By then, Rudolf Hess had drifted to the periphery of Hitler's inner circle. Once the designated deputy Führer, Hess was now a man overshadowed, clinging to scraps of influence as others elbowed him aside. Modern historians tend to look at his infamous flight to Scotland through the lens of desperation and psychological decline. Hess had become a man consumed by mysticism, astrology, and the conviction that fate, or perhaps some supernatural force, had chosen him as a peacemaker. He was obsessed with the idea that secret factions in Britain longed for peace with Germany, and he believed that only he could broker that deal. Now, this wasn't just idle gossip. British doctors who examined Hess during his wartime internment described a worrying cocktail of paranoia, wild mood swings, and signs of what we'd now call bipolar disorder. Hess toggled between hope and hopelessness, making grand pronouncements one day, sliding into depression the next. So, one of the most straightforward theories is that Hess, gripped by delusions, decided to take to the skies in a solo bid for peace, driven more by fantasy than reality. But if you think that's the end of the story, think again. The case of Rudolf Hess is a World War mystery that refuses to be solved neatly. For every psychiatrist who diagnosed him as unstable, there's a historian or a conspiracy theorist asking, did Hess really act alone? Or was his mission part of a bigger, darker plan? Was Hitler truly blindsided? Or was there a hidden hand guiding the Deputy Führer's actions? Let's dig in. The official story, repeated for decades, is that Hitler was absolutely stunned and furious when he learned of Hess's flight. Nazi propaganda denounced Hess as deranged and acting without orders. Most researchers today accept that Hitler's rage was genuine. His outburst was not staged for the cameras. But peel back the layers and things get murkier. Some of Hess's contemporaries and later commentators argued that Hitler's anger was a performance, a calculated move to distance himself from a failed diplomatic gambit. After all, if the mission succeeded, it could have been spun as a masterstroke. If it failed, Hess would take the fall as an unhinged lone wolf. This theory got a boost decades after the war, when newly released files from Russian archives reignited the debate. In 2011, a document surfaced, a 28-page statement from Karl-Heinz Pinch, who served as Hess's adjutant. Pinch, interrogated while in Soviet captivity, claimed that Hitler had been told about Hess's plan in advance. According to his account, Hitler received news of Hess's disappearance with remarkable calm. Pinch suggested that the whole thing had been plotted. Hess was sent to try to secure peace and possibly an economic agreement with Britain before Germany invaded the Soviet Union. If Hess succeeded, it would be a diplomatic coup. If he failed, Hitler could plausibly deny involvement and paint Hess as unstable. Of course, there's a catch. Pinch was a prisoner, and the Soviets had every reason to promote the idea of secret Nazi-British deals. After all, it bolstered their own wartime propaganda. And let's not forget that multiple witnesses described Hitler as genuinely shocked and enraged. His reaction hardly smacks of someone calmly executing a secret plan. So, was Pinch's testimony a bombshell, or just another layer of Cold War intrigue? Most scholars remain skeptical, but the door isn't fully closed. Now, imagine for a moment that Hess wasn't the only architect of this bizarre mission. What if British intelligence was involved? Some persistent rumors claim that MI6 or other shadowy agencies dangled the carrot of secret negotiations, luring Hess into their trap. Joseph Stalin, for one, never bought the idea that Hess had acted without British collusion. The Soviets pushed the theory that British agents, perhaps posing as intermediaries for the Duke of Hamilton, sent fake letters or signals, convincing Hess that peace talks were possible. This could explain why Hess was so adamant that he had a personal connection with the Duke. insisting on his arrival in Scotland as though a warm welcome awaited. Was Hess, in fact, manipulated by the British? Could MI6 have spotted his eccentricities and played on his hopes for peace? Maybe they considered him the weakest link in the Nazi leadership, vulnerable to manipulation. It's certainly possible that British intelligence picked up on Hess's increasingly erratic behavior and exploited it, either by feeding him misinformation or encouraging his delusions through back channels. Yet, if that's true, we'd expect to see some solid proof by now. Letters, intercepted messages, official memos. So far, nothing definitive has surfaced, just tantalizing hints and endless speculation. For the rest of World War II, Rudolf Hess languished in British custody, his fate a subject of ongoing debate. In 1945, he was delivered back to Germany for the Nuremberg trials, where the world watched as he oscillated between blank apathy and bizarre claims of amnesia. At one point, he insisted he had no memory of the war at all. Yet he was ultimately deemed sane enough to stand trial. It's important to point out that the legal definition of sanity at Nuremberg focused on his mental state at the time of his crimes, not during the trial itself. Convicted of crimes against peace, Hess received a life sentence. From 1947 onward, he became the sole inmate of Berlin's Spandau prison, a lonely relic as other war criminals were released or died. For 40 years he was guarded in rotation by American, British, French, and Soviet soldiers, a solitary figure whose very existence kept the mystery alive. Even his death in 1987, officially ruled a suicide at age 93, became the subject of fresh speculation. Did Hess really end his own life, or was this yet another cover-up to hide inconvenient truths? And so, the questions linger. Was Rudolf Hess a delusional lone actor, or was he a pawn in a high-stakes game of deception? Did British intelligence pull the strings, or did Hitler send his deputy on a secret mission, ready to disavow him if it all went wrong? To this day, no conclusive evidence has surfaced to close the file on the Hess affair. Somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten archive or a sealed government vault, the final answer may still be waiting. And with that, the curtain falls, for now, on the enduring enigma of Rudolf Hess's mission to Scotland. But the Second World War was a stage crowded with mysteries, and as the smoke of one incident fades, another rises on the horizon. On a cold February afternoon in 1942, thick black smoke billowed over Manhattan's west side as flames devoured one of the world's most magnificent ocean liners. The story of the SS Normandy and its transformation from floating palace to wartime tragedy is up next. People on the streets craned their necks, pointing up as flames leapt skyward from Pier 88. The source? The SS Normandy, one of the world's most magnificent ocean liners, was being consumed by fire, marking its tragic transformation from floating palace to wartime casualty. None other